Hi, I'll continue with paragraph 7 from the chapter on the Anschlag in Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's Versuch über die wahre Art das Klavier zu spielen. And these paragraphs deal with the dotted Anschlag, which will also be called in modern times the double appoggiatura. Der Anschlag mit den Punkten wird entweder durch einen Vorschlag von unten oder durch die bei Figur 85 befindliche Vorstellung angedeutet. Wird auf verschiedene Arten in den Takt eingeteilt. In den Probestücken habe ich dieses allezeit deutlich ausgedruckt. Der folgenden Note wird so viel von ihrer Geltung abgezogen, als dieser Anschlag beträgt. Im folgenden Exempel sieht man die unrechte und rechte Andeutung dieser Manier. As I've just read, according to Bach, in the keyboard music of that era, what we're going to find indicating the dotted Anschlag ornament will be either an appoggiatura from below or the sign in figure 85. Both will do it, which is an important detail, meaning that whenever we encounter an appoggiatura from below in scores from in and around that period, it could always be that the appoggiatura we are looking at is, in fact, a dotted Anschlag, which is something different. How many dotted Anschlags in the music from that time will have, as a result, been missed? If nobody's being made aware of the correlation between the appoggiatura from below and the dotted Anschlag, nobody's going to know to check. However, not all appoggiaturas from below will be dotted Anschlags. So we'll be learning from Bach how we can distinguish a regular appoggiatura from below from one that could be representing a dotted Anschlag. The first example of figure 85 indicates it with the sign, a dotted quaver and semiquaver figure in small notes, or a dotted 8-note and 16-note figure. And it's a half note or minim that follows the ornament in that example. Bach says the dotted Anschlag will be divided up in the bar in various ways. And it could be that Bach chose to include a half note in this first example, because with such a note, the dotted Anschlag could be subject to more variation in how it is divided up in the bar compared to when it's attached to notes with shorter values, like a quarter note for instance, which would make it a suitable example to accompany his statement that the dotted Anschlag will be divided up in the bar in various ways. Plus, he could be throwing us a curveball from the very outset to get us thinking, where we'll scratch our heads as we wonder how exactly the dotted Anschlag in this specific case is to be performed. And because the execution of this one isn't necessarily so clear-cut, I won't demonstrate it yet, but rather I'll apply the information that follows and demonstrate it then. In Sonata 4, the Allegretto Grazioso in B minor, and that's the first movement of the Sonata 4 of his Probestücken, as he mentioned in the paragraph, or as practice pieces that go with his Versuch. So in that Allegretto grazioso, Bach indicated the dotted Anschlag with a dotted 8th note, then followed it not with a 16th note as he does in the examples, but with a 32nd note. It is that change to the second note value that Bach uses to indicate its distribution clearly. Finally, Bach tells us, as he has said regarding all ornaments indicated via small notes, that the value of those notes will be deducted from the value of the following principal note to which they belong. Here's a recap of half of paragraph 23 and of paragraph 24 from the chapter on ornaments in general on that matter. Alle durch kleine Nötchen angedeutete Manieren gehören zur folgenden Note. Folglich darf niemals der vorhergehenden etwas von ihrer Geltung abgebrochen werden, indem bloß die folgende so viel verliert, als die kleinen Nötchen betragen. Diese Anmerkung ist so viel nötiger, je mehr gemeiniglich hier wieder gefehlt wird. Vermöge dieser Regel werden also, statt der folgenden Hauptnote, diese kleinen Nötchen zum Basse oder anderen Stimmen zugleich angeschlagen. Man schleift durch sie in die folgende Note hinein. Hier wieder wird gar sehr oft gefehlt, indem man auf eine raue Art in die Hauptnote hineinplumpt, nachdem noch vulgar dazu die mit den kleinen Noten vergesellschaftete Manieren ungeschickt an- und herausgebracht worden sind. It coincides with what is being said here in paragraph 7. And given how often this is violated by those generation of roll of honour experts in what they do, by the example they set, in the advice they're dishing out, I don't think one can repeat it often enough. And finally, in the appendix containing the material that was added to the 1787 edition, we see in the execution die Ausführung, the first appoggiatura of the dotted Anschlag, which is a D, taking up half the value of the principal quarter note, an E. From what I can gather, Bach is illustrating in this extra information that if the first appoggiatura of the dotted Anschlag is intended to take up half the value of the principal note, rather than adjusting the values of the dotted indication, the dot is removed. I mean, he did add in the correct indication a tail to the second note, turning it into a 32nd note. Further evidence that he indicates the dotted Anschlag's distribution with the value of the second note, as it coincides with what he did in the practice piece. The value of the second note will tell us when it is to be introduced. In his Versuch examples, on the other hand, he always represented the dotted Anschlag as a dotted 8th note with a 16th note following. But as far as the value of the note with the dot is concerned, rather than adjusting its value, the dot is removed. One could deduce from the incorrect and correct indication that the first appoggiatura of a dotted Anschlag, when dotted, is normally intended to be held longer than half the value of its principal note. That can be kept in mind when figuring out how to execute figure 85. We'll be holding out the E of the dotted Anschlag for longer than half the value of the F. And since Bach did include a dot in its sign, we could deduce that it would be incorrect to only let the E take up half the value of the F. So here's a possible way to perform the dotted Anschlag in figure 85. The appendix to paragraph 11 from the chapter on appoggiaturas could provide a clue as to how to regard the indicated value of the first appoggiatura of the dotted Anschlag and the discrepancy when one has to hold it for longer than the sign's dotted 8-note value, as one would have to do in the first figure 85 example. Bei Vorschlägen, wobei von dieser gewöhnlichen Regel abgewichen wird, tut man wohl, dass man sie mit in den Takt einteilt. Die Zerstreuung und auch bisweilen die Vermutung, als ob der Kopist den Vorschlag nicht akkurat genug geschwänzt habe, weil vor diesem alle Vorschläge ohne Unterschied in der Geltung der Oktel vorgeschrieben wurden, kann in der Ausführung Fehler veranlassen, welche den Gesang verstellen und auch wohl zuweilen eine unreine Harmonie verursachen. The original practice of all appoggiaturas being indicated, regardless of length, by an 8th note could be the basis on which the sign of the dotted Anschlag is built, and why its first note's written out value doesn't change. The execution of the appendix example has no dotted rhythm with the first appoggiatura. I can only conclude that if there's no dotted rhythm in its execution, there's no dot in the sign. The incorrect indication creates a no man's land, where no dotted rhythm is possible, without the altered written out value of the dotted note of the sign becoming redundant, that is, or where, if one were to adhere strictly to the time values of the sign to preserve a dotted rhythm, we have a scenario like the one I just read in paragraph 24, where the second appoggiatura, the F, takes from the value of the preceding appoggiatura, the D, instead of the following note. And we then, in a rough way, plop into the principal note, after the ornament represented by the small notes has been introduced and executed unskillfully. Something that can be taken for granted, because nature makes it so, regardless of who is doing it and the level of skill or experience they're bringing to the table. A good example of that in practice is in the second movement of Beethoven's Les Bevol Sonata, Les Adieux. And in the main melodic section of it, one can see the roll of honor, the way they introduce those ornaments indicated by small notes, how they are taking from the value of the preceding note and not from the value of the following note. You can hear, and it doesn't matter if it's Kissin you're listening to or any of the top players, you can hear those ornaments being introduced and executed unskillfully. And it doesn't matter the level of skill that Kissin has. He can't help but introduce them and execute them unskillfully. And that section will come up in the first half of that movement, and then in the second half in octaves. And in both sections you can clearly hear the difference when you compare it to my playing, which is representing, I'm playing it according to the true way. So what you hear is how that part of the movement will be played when one plays according to the true way that Bach is sharing. And which one version would you like to be playing? And you can hear them introducing, executing the ornament unskillfully and plopping into the principal note. There's another take on this in paragraph 25 from the chapter on appoggiaturas. In the preceding paragraph, Bach looks at two commonly occurring mistakes regarding appoggiaturas. So he addressed more mistakes in the chapter, and in this one he looks at two additional commonly occurring mistakes. The second of those coincides with what I am referring to here. He says, Der zweite Fehler ist, wenn man den Vorschlag von seiner folgenden Note abreißt, indem man ihn entweder nicht genugsam aushält oder wohl gar in der Einteilung der vorhergehenden Note mit anhängt. Figur 20a. What I mentioned would be effectively doing the same as what is depicted in the second example of 20a. Bach elaborates on that in paragraph 25. He says, Aus diesem letzten Versehen sind die hässlichen Nachschläge entstanden, die sogar außerordentlich Mode sind und welche leider noch dazu nicht eher gebraucht werden als bei den sangbarsten Gedanken. Zum Exempel B. Wenn ja Vorschläge hierbei angebracht werden sollten und müssten, so ist die Ausführung bei den mit Stern markierten Beispielen leidlicher. Man sieht hieraus, dass man diese Fehler verbessern kann, wenn aus diesen Nachschlägen Vorschläge werden. Bei Figur 21 ist ein Fall, wo die Nachschläge gut und gewöhnlich sind. Das letzte Exempel ist mehr Mode als nach der Harmonie reine. This is to some degree regarding that same issue addressed in paragraph 23 and 24 from the chapter on ornaments in general, from another perspective. To perform the dotted Anschlag by adhering to the time values of the incorrect indication with the intention of preserving a valid dotted rhythm, one creates an ugly afterstroke or Nachschlag. Both notes, by the way, of the dotted Anschlag are appoggiaturas, which will be covered in paragraph 9. In the execution, we see the second appoggiatura taking its space from the remaining value of the principal note, and thus sliding into that note, that E, or alternatively, turning the afterstroke, the ugly Nachschlag of the incorrect indication, into a Vorschlag, an appoggiatura, or a before stroke. So this bit of extra sheds a lot of light onto the thinking behind the notation, how thought through it can be, and the understanding of the nature of ornamenting and its underlying thread. I may be referring to it in the next paragraphs whenever it relates. The execution, if its dotted Anschlag had been indicated by a mere appoggiatura from below, would serve as an example of how the dotted Anschlag will be divided up in the bar in various ways, even with a quarter note. Although technically, I'm not sure it could still be called a dotted Anschlag, or the Anschlag mit den Punkten, if the dot is gone. In that case, the term double appoggiatura would cover that discrepancy or indiscretion, whatever it might be called. Okay, I'll leave it at that for this video, and I'll pick up where I left off in the next. Thanks. Bye.